When my mother looked my son in the eye and said, "You'll never be anything, just like your father," I didn't say a word. I didn't defend him. I didn't correct her. I didn't even flinch. I stood there in the hallway of her house with a bag of groceries in one hand and my whole heart in the other, and I said nothing. I don't think I'll ever forget the way Jalen looked at me in that moment. Not angry, not even sad, just quiet. Like something in him folded in on itself. A 10-year-old boy standing there with his sketchbook tucked under his arm, hearing his grandmother tell him he was doomed to become a failure, and watching his mother stay silent. That silence still echoes in me. My name is Maya Carter. I'm 34 years old. I've been a single mom since I was 23, and I've made a lot of mistakes, but none have haunted me like that one. I grew up in a house where love was tough and softness was seen as weakness. My mother, Dolores, raised me alone after my father walked out when I was 10. She worked hard, put food on the table, kept the lights on, and never let me forget any of it. She had this unshakable belief that feelings were a luxury people like us couldn't afford. Her favorite line was, "Life doesn't care how you feel. It only cares what you do." So when I got pregnant with Jalen and then got left by Andre a year later, I knew what she thought of me. I'd repeated her story, she said, only worse. But I wasn't like her. At least I thought I wasn't. I tried to raise Jalen differently. I told him I loved him every day. I read to him at night. I never raised my voice. When he cried, I listened. When he struggled in school, I sat beside him until the homework made sense. I was trying. I thought that was enough. But we were living in her house. After I lost my job during the pandemic, we moved into her guest room. It was supposed to be temporary. 2 months turned into 6, then a year. And in that time, Jalen, my sweet, gentle boy, became the target of her disappointment. She saw too much of his father in him, his quiet nature, the way he'd retreat into his imagination, how he cried at sad movies or got nervous before presentations. "He's too soft," she'd mutter. "That boy needs a spine." And I'd roll my eyes, maybe sigh, maybe tell her to ease up. But I never really pushed back. I never made her stop, until the day she said it. Jalen had just gotten home from school. He was excited about something. Some drawing he'd done in art class, I think. He held it out to show her, and she barely looked at it. Instead, she scoffed and said, "You'll never be anything, just like your father." I swear time stopped. Jalen froze. My mouth went dry. I looked at him, then at her, and then back again, and I said nothing. It's the kind of silence that doesn't pass with time. It stays with you. It burrows deep. I saw the way his shoulders dropped, the way his eyes went blank. That light he always carried, it dimmed. Not all at once, but I saw it. From that moment forward, he started shrinking into himself. He stopped showing me his drawings. He stopped talking as much. He started writing more, hiding pages in his backpack. I thought it was just school stress, or puberty, or maybe he was just tired, but it wasn't. It was hurt, from her words, and from my silence. I wish I could tell you I stood up for him right away, that I marched into her room and laid into her, but I didn't. I made dinner, I checked his homework, I tucked him into bed, and I sat in the dark that night thinking, what kind of mother lets her child be told that he's nothing and doesn't fight back? I was afraid, not of her, but of what it might stir up in me, of saying too much, of losing the roof over our heads, of realizing I might be more like her than I wanted to admit. But something changed that day, not in her, not even in me, in him. Jalen didn't just go quiet. He started observing, processing, turning that pain into something else, something none of us saw coming, not until the night of the school ceremony, the letter, the last line, and the tears that finally came from the one person I thought would never break. This story isn't about revenge or shame. It's about a moment, one moment, the moment a boy was told he'd never be anything, and how he answered that not with anger, but with a voice powerful enough to silence a room and make his grandmother cry for the first time in 20 years. Before everything changed, our life was quiet, not peaceful, quiet. The kind of quiet that comes with routine, with surviving, not thriving. Every day was a loop. Wake up at 6, heat up some instant oatmeal, drop Jalen off at school, then rush to my morning shift at the diner. On good days, I'd squeeze in a few hours cleaning houses in the afternoons. On bad ones, I'd go straight home, counting the minutes until I could fall into bed and forget how tired I was. We lived in my mother's guest room. It wasn't big, barely space for our twin beds and a plastic dresser, but it was clean. Jalen kept his sketchbook stacked neatly in the corner, his pens and pencils organized in little cups he'd made from recycled soda bottles. He took pride in the small things. Always has. My mother, Dolores, made sure we followed her rules. No shoes in the house, no raised voices, no TV after 8, and absolutely no softness, whatever that meant. To outsiders, she was impressive. Worked her way up from a retail clerk to a store manager, paid off her mortgage early, never missed a Sunday in church. People respected her. But growing up with her, it was like living under a microscope. Nothing was ever quite enough. Not grades, not appearance, not effort. Even joy had to be justified. She had her own traumas. I know that now. But back then, it just felt like walking on eggshells. The only way to survive was to be smaller, quieter. So I learned to fold into myself. And when I got pregnant with Jalen at 23, her disappointment was loud and unfiltered. You made your bed. Now lie in it. That was her version of support. Andre, Jalen's father, was around for the first few months. He had dreams of being a music producer, but reality hit fast. He started drinking more, working less. Then he disappeared. I heard rumors of an arrest, sometime in county jail, but he never came back. Dolores barely spoke his name, but when she did, it was like spitting poison. So when Jalen started showing signs of being different, gentler, softer, more emotionally in tune, it didn't take long before she started connecting dots. And none of those dots painted a picture she respected. Jalen wasn't like the boys on TV. He didn't care about sports or action figures. He cared about stories. He'd sit on the porch and draw for hours. Trees, buildings, sometimes characters from the books he read. He was smart but not loud about it. And he felt everything. If a classmate cried, he was the first to sit beside them. If he saw a stray dog on the street, he'd beg me to bring it home. He wrote little poems, stuck sticky notes on the fridge that said things like, "Hope you smile today, Mom." He was everything I'd hoped to raise. Thoughtful, kind, curious. But to my mother, those traits didn't count. You need to toughen that boy up. He cries too much. He needs to grow a spine, not feelings. She said things like that daily, usually when she thought he couldn't hear, but kids hear everything. I tried to walk a line. I didn't want to fight her. I owed her too much. She was helping us, putting a roof over our heads, keeping the lights on when I couldn't. I told myself we'd move out soon, just a few more months. I thought I could protect Jalen by cushioning him, by softening her rough edges in the retelling. But I was wrong. Looking back, I can see the shift in him. He stopped showing her his drawings. Stopped talking during dinner. He became a quiet shadow around her. And I knew, deep down, that he'd started learning the same lesson I had at his age. Your feelings don't belong here. The worst part? I didn't stop it. I didn't stand up for him. I was surviving, just like always. But he was only 10. He didn't have the tools yet. He was still figuring out who he was, and now he was already being told who not to be. I remember one evening, I found one of his sketches in the trash. It was torn in half. On one side, he'd drawn himself with angel wings, standing on a hill under the stars. On the other half, he'd written, "What if I can't be what they need me to be?" That question broke me in a way I didn't show. Not then, but it stayed with me. I taped that sketch back together and hid it in my journal, because I knew a storm was coming, and I knew, when it hit, our quiet wouldn't survive it. I didn't realize how much damage one sentence could do until I saw what silence looks like in a child. After my mom said what she said to Jalen, that he'd never be anything, just like your father, something in him changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no tears, no tantrums, just stillness. A kind of quiet that felt too deep for a 10-year-old. The next morning, he didn't ask for waffles like he usually did. He just grabbed a granola bar, stuffed it in his backpack, and mumbled, "I'm good." He barely looked at me. And when I tried to hug him before school, he kept his arms to his sides. It was like watching him slowly disappear behind glass. At first, I told myself it would pass. He was tired, maybe having a rough week. Maybe it was just school pressure. Kids have moods, right? But then he stopped drawing. That was the first red flag I couldn't ignore. Jalen always drew. It didn't matter if he was happy, bored, sad, excited. He had a pencil in his hand, sketchbooks in every room, napkins covered in doodles, stars and little quotes scribbled in the margins of his homework, and then nothing. The pencils stayed in the cup. The notebooks were untouched. His desk looked too clean. I noticed the light in his eyes start to dim, not in one moment, but gradually, like a lamp running out of power. I tried to talk to him. "Hey, baby, you want to draw with me tonight?" He shrugged. "I'm not really in the mood." "You sure everything's okay?" He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the floor. "I'm just tired, Mom, that's all." But he wasn't tired. He was retreating, and I knew exactly what that felt like, because I'd done the same thing when I was his age. You learn early how to shrink yourself when the people who are supposed to love you make you feel like a disappointment. I started noticing other signs. His grades were slipping. His teacher, Ms. Fowler, called one afternoon. "Jalen's still doing his work," she said, "but he's not himself. He used to participate. He used to ask thoughtful questions. Lately, he just stares out the window. He doesn't talk much." My stomach dropped. She paused, then added, "He's been writing a lot, though, in his journal, more than usual. You might want to take a look." That night, while he was in the shower, I gently unzipped the front pocket of his backpack and pulled out a spiral notebook. It wasn't one I recognized. The cover had a small drawing of a boy standing under rain clouds. I opened it, expecting to see sketches, but it was filled with letters. Letters he'd never sent. One was to me, one to his dad, and 3 to someone he just called her. I knew who her was. In one entry, he wrote, "Sometimes I think I'm invisible. Like people see what they expect instead of who I am. They say I'm soft, like that's a bad thing, but maybe softness is what keeps me from turning cold." Another one said, "If I do something amazing, will she stop seeing Dad when she looks at me? Will she see me?" I sat there in the dark, that notebook open on my lap, feeling like the worst kind of coward. My son was quietly bleeding inside a house that I had convinced myself was safe, and I had let it happen by saying nothing, by not setting boundaries, by choosing peace over protection. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront my mother, to tell her everything she said was poison, and she was the reason her grandson was fading right in front of her. But part of me was still that scared little girl in her shadow. So instead, I cried. Silently. Alone. Jalen never said a word about the letters. He probably didn't know I read them, but something shifted in me that night. I started watching him more closely. Not just the way he moved, but the way he held himself, like he was trying not to take up space. And then one afternoon I came home from work and found him at the kitchen table, writing again. This time, it wasn't his journal. It was something else. Longer, focused, intense. I asked him what he was working on. He looked up for the first time in days and said, "There's this statewide writing contest. Miss Fowler said I should enter." I stared at him for a second, surprised. "You want to?" He shrugged, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of defiance. "I don't know. Maybe if I write it right, they'll finally hear me." That one sentence stopped me cold. It was the first time he'd said they. Not grandma, not you, but they. As if the whole world had lumped him into a box and taped it shut. I knew in that moment, this wasn't just about one comment. This was about everything he'd carried silently for years. And I wasn't going to be silent anymore. When Jalen told me he wanted to enter the statewide writing contest, I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said before he could even finish his sentence. "Whatever you need, I'm in." I didn't say it just to encourage him. I said it because I needed to do something. I needed to show up. After everything I hadn't said, all the moments I had swallowed my voice to keep the peace, I finally understood. Silence wasn't neutral. It was a choice, and I'd chosen wrong. He handed me the contest flyer like it was made of glass, half expecting me to shrug it off, I think. But I read every line. Submission deadline in 6 weeks. Theme, the power of a voice. Essays or personal narratives. Age group, middle school. Jalen folded his arms, nervous. "I don't think I'll win or anything. I want to try." I nodded, holding back tears. "Trying is winning, baby." That night, he stayed up late outlining ideas. I made tea and sat across from him at the kitchen table, pretending to read a book, but really just watching him. For the first time in weeks, there was life in his hands. He was moving with purpose. He scribbled, crossed things out, mumbled things to himself under his breath, and I just watched, heartbreaking and swelling at the same time. The next few weeks became a quiet rhythm: school, writing, dinner, writing. I shifted my schedule around to get home earlier. When I couldn't afford a babysitter, I brought him to the diner with me and let him work in the booth during my shift. One night, I found him asleep at the table, cheek resting on his notebook. I gently lifted his head, placed a pillow under him, and flipped through the pages. He hadn't titled it yet, but the story hit me like a punch in the gut. It wasn't fiction. It was him. He was writing about what it felt like to grow up being misunderstood, about how silence can feel louder than screaming, about what it's like to carry the weight of other people's bitterness and never know if it's yours to hold. He wrote about his dad, about me, about her. He never named Grandma, but the shadow of her words was all over every paragraph. What floored me was the honesty. It wasn't angry, it was thoughtful, raw, poetic. He wrote with the kind of clarity that made me feel ashamed and proud all at once. The next morning, I asked him if he wanted help editing it. He shrugged. "Maybe just the spelling," he said. "I don't want it to sound like someone else wrote it." I smiled. "It already sounds like you. That's the best part." We spent 3 more nights polishing it. I resisted the urge to change too much. His voice didn't need fixing, it needed protecting. At the post office, he stood beside me as we sealed the envelope. He bit his lip, nervous. I could tell he wanted to pull it back. "I can still not send it," he said softly. "I mean, it's kind of personal." I knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and said, "It's brave, and it might help someone else feel seen. But it's your choice." He stared at the envelope, then nodded. "Let's send it." When we dropped it in the mailbox, I swear I felt something lift off both our shoulders. It was a small white rectangle, but inside it was everything he'd held back, everything I'd failed to protect, everything we'd both been carrying in silence. Weeks passed. He didn't talk about the contest much. I didn't push. But I watched him. He started sketching again. Not as much, but enough. He smiled more. He helped me cook dinner. He even gave his grandmother a polite good night one evening. Not warm, but not hollow either. Progress. Then one day, a letter came from the school. At first, I thought it was another notice about lunch balances or a PTA event. But when I opened it, I stopped breathing. Jalen's essay had been selected for the statewide finalists ceremony. He was invited to read it aloud at the closing segment of the event. I showed him the letter that evening. His eyes widened, then narrowed. "In front of everyone?" he asked. "Only if you want to," I replied. He paused. "Do you think she'll be there?" He didn't have to say who. "She might," I said honestly, "but this time, you get to speak." Jalen looked at the letter again, then whispered, "Then yeah, I want to." That was the moment everything shifted, not just for him, but for me too, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to manage the damage. I was helping someone heal from it, and that healing didn't start with fighting back. It started with listening. The school auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, students, hundreds of people dressed in their best, buzzing with chatter and polite applause. It smelled like flowers and cheap perfume. I sat in the middle row, hands clenched in my lap, eyes fixed on the stage like it might disappear if I blinked. Jalen was backstage. He was calm, or at least he looked that way. But I knew my son. His fingers fidgeted when he was nervous. He rubbed the inside of his wrist with his thumb. He took deeper breaths than usual. And today, he'd been doing all 3. To my right, Dolores sat in a stiff, charcoal gray pantsuit, holding her purse like it was armor. She hadn't said much since we picked her up. Just a tight smile when I told her Jalen was reading something he'd written. Her voice on the drive over still echoed in my ears. "Well, let's hope he doesn't embarrass himself." I almost turned the car around. But I didn't, because this wasn't about her, not anymore. The ceremony moved quickly, awards for science, math, community service. Students took the stage, smiling wide, holding up certificates as proud parents snapped photos. Then the principal stepped up to the microphone. "For our final presentation of the evening," she said, "we're honored to have one of our own students close the ceremony with a very special reading. This piece was selected from more than 400 submissions across the state, and before he begins, someone asked that he read a short note first." I felt my breath hitch. Jalen stepped onto the stage, holding a folded letter in one hand and his essay in the other. He looked small behind the podium, but when he cleared his throat and began reading, his voice didn't shake. "Dear Jalen, you don't know me very well, and truthfully, I haven't earned the right to be called your father, but I read your words, and they changed me." My heart stopped. Dolores stiffened beside me. "I've spent years running from the man I was, but you've become everything I never had the courage to be. You're kind. You're real. You feel things I buried. You're not like me, Jalen. You're better. You've given me something I thought I lost. Hope. Please don't ever stop writing. Love, Dad." There was a ripple of silence across the room, and then a few quiet gasps. Dolores's hands tightened on her purse until her knuckles turned white. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes weren't hard anymore. Jalen unfolded his essay and looked out at the audience. Then he began. His voice was steady, every word chosen with care. He spoke about silence, not just the kind you hear, but the kind that lives inside you when you're constantly told what you're not. He described what it felt like to grow up with someone always measuring you against someone else, someone you'd never even met. He spoke of being told he was too sensitive and how that made him believe something was broken in him. He paused only once, looked down at his paper, looked back up. "But I'm not broken. I'm just quiet, and that doesn't mean I'm empty. It means I'm listening." That line. God, that line. You could feel the shift in the room. Teachers leaned forward. Parents wiped their eyes. Even the kids were quiet. People say I look like my dad. Maybe I do, but I'm not becoming him. I'm becoming someone new. I'm becoming someone worth listening to. He finished. For a second, there was nothing. Then the room erupted, clapping, whistling. A few people even stood. Jalen stepped back from the mic, blinking like he couldn't quite process what was happening. He looked toward me. I stood. My hands clapped until they stung. Beside me, my mother stayed seated. She didn't clap. She didn't move. And then, without warning, her shoulders jerked, her face crumpled, and she cried. Dolores Carter, who hadn't cried in 20 years, who once told me that crying was for people who didn't have jobs to do, was crying in the middle of a school auditorium in front of strangers and parents and teachers. I didn't say a word, because for once, she didn't need one. Jalen walked back down the aisle, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. He didn't look like a boy who needed fixing anymore. He looked like someone who had stepped out of the shadow and into his own story. And in that moment, I knew he had become exactly who he was meant to be. Not like his father, not like me, just himself. The ride home after the ceremony was silent, but not the kind of silence we'd known before, not the tight, strained silence that fills a room like smoke. This one felt peaceful, like everyone was still trying to catch their breath. Jalen sat in the back seat holding the letter from his father in both hands, folded neatly like it might crumble if he wasn't careful. He didn't say anything, just stared out the window, but with a small, quiet smile on his face. Not wide. He was content. Dolores sat next to me in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at him. She just stared straight ahead, her face pale, her lips drawn tight like she was still trying to hold something in. I didn't press her. I didn't need to. Something inside her cracked open that night. I don't know what she saw in Jalen on that stage. Maybe the son she never had, maybe the girl she used to be, maybe just truth she couldn't deny. But whatever it was, it got through. When we pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine and waited. Dolores finally spoke. Her voice was low, hoarse, like she hadn't used it in hours. I didn't know he was hurting like that. I looked at her, surprised. He's a quiet kid. She shook her head slowly. He's something else. She got out of the car before I could respond. Jalen followed me inside. He was humming softly under his breath. He went to the fridge, grabbed a juice box, and then paused. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." "Was Grandma crying?" I smiled gently. Yeah, she was. He nodded like he'd already known. Then he went to our room and pulled out his sketchbook for the first time in weeks. That night, I sat on my bed with the letter from his dad in my hands. I read it 3 more times. I didn't know how it ended up in the principal's hands or how Andre had read Jalen's story, but I found out later that Ms. Fowler had submitted the essay to the state board anonymously, and they'd published excerpts in the local newsletter. Somehow, it reached him. Sometimes the past comes back in ways you don't expect. Sometimes it tries to make amends. Jalen didn't ask to write Andre back, and I didn't push. He needed time. And for the first time in a long time, time was something we had. A few days after the ceremony, I came home from work to find a sticky note on my nightstand, Jalen's handwriting. "Thank you for not letting my voice disappear." I sat on the edge of the bed and cried. It wasn't just that I was proud of him, I was. But I was also ashamed of how long it took me to stand up, to choose courage over comfort. I realized I hadn't just been silent for him. I'd been silent for myself. And in doing that, I almost passed on the very thing I'd tried so hard to protect him from. Cycles don't break on their own. They break when someone decides the silence ends here. The following weekend, Dolores did something I never saw coming. She knocked on Jalen's door while he was drawing and asked if he'd show her what he was working on. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her. Then he slowly turned the sketchbook toward her, revealing a pencil drawing of a boy standing on a mountaintop, a pen in one hand and a broken chain in the other. Dolores looked at it for a long time. "That's powerful," she said. Jalen didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Her words, this time, were enough. Our home didn't magically change overnight. There were still awkward moments, still layers to peel back, still old patterns that tried to resurface. Something had shifted between all of us. I started saying more, correcting more, loving louder, and Dolores in her own way started softening, just enough. Jalen? He bloomed. He wrote more. He sketched more. He submitted another story to the school paper, and a few weeks later he taped a small message above his bed. It said, "I am not who they say I am. I am who I choose to become." That's the voice I almost lost him to. That's the voice I'll never stop fighting to protect. And that moment at the school ceremony, when he stood on stage, spoke his truth, and read a line that made my mother cry, that wasn't just his moment. It was ours. Because sometimes it takes a child to say what the adults are too afraid to admit. That love isn't silence. It's showing up. It's listening. And sometimes it's saying, enough. If this story touched you, even just a little, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's been quiet too long. Maybe someone raising a child in a world that keeps trying to shut them down. Maybe someone who's been told they're too soft and believed it. And if you've ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up, I get it. I've been there. But it's never too late to choose differently. Thank you for listening, for holding space for this story, for letting Jalen's voice, and maybe your own, be heard. If you felt something, say something. In the comments, tell me, have you ever broken a cycle? Have you ever been the first voice in your family to say, enough? I read every comment. I really do. And if you want more real stories like this about healing, honesty, and growth, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because stories don't just change minds, they heal hearts. And sometimes they even change the people who said they never would. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.